History class can sometimes feel like a long list of dates and facts, right? But what if I told you that some of the biggest facts we all learned are actually, well, not quite right? Get ready, because today we're busting three massive historical myths that will completely change how you see the past. Let's start with one of the most significant events of the 20th century, World War II. Ask anyone when the US joined the war, and they'll likely say, after Pearl Harbor. And they're not wrong, but that's only part of the story. It simplifies a much more complex and fascinating reality. For years, long before the tragic attack on December 7, 1941, the United States was deeply, though unofficially, involved in the conflict. President Franklin D. Roosevelt saw the growing threat of the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, and knew that a neutral stance might not be enough to protect American interests and global democracy. He had to navigate a very tricky political landscape. The American public was overwhelmingly isolationist, still scarred by the memory of World War I. They wanted nothing to do with another European war. So, how did Roosevelt help the Allies without officially declaring war? Through some incredibly clever political maneuvering. The first big step was the cash and carry policy of 1939. This allowed warring nations to buy U.S. goods, including weapons, but only if they paid in cash and transported the items on their own ships. On the surface, it seemed neutral, but in reality, who did it help? Great Britain and France. They had the navies and the cash to take advantage of the offer, while Germany, blockaded by the British Royal Navy, could not. It was a lifeline disguised as a business transaction. But as France fell and Britain stood alone, it became clear that cash and carry wasn't enough. Britain was running out of money. So, in March 1941, Roosevelt introduced a game-changing program, the Lend-Lease Act. This was a masterstroke. The act gave the president the power to sell, transfer, exchange, or lend equipment and supplies to any nation deemed vital to the defense of the United States. Roosevelt famously compared it to lending a garden hose to a neighbor whose house is on fire. You don't ask for payment, you just want your hose back after the fire is out. This act effectively made the United States the arsenal of democracy. Billions of dollars worth of planes, tanks, ships, and other supplies flowed to Britain, the Soviet Union, after Germany invaded them, and China. American factories roared back to life, pulling the country out of the Great Depression and directly fueling the Allied war effort. So, while American soldiers weren't officially fighting, American industry most certainly was. The U.S. was choosing a side, and it was doing so decisively. The attack on Pearl Harbor was the final devastating push that silenced the isolationist debate and led to a formal declaration of war, but the U.S. had been in the fight in spirit and in material for a long time. Now for our second myth, and it's a heavy one. Many people believe that the primary motivation for the Allied powers, especially after the U.S. entered the war, was to stop the Holocaust and save Europe's Jewish population. The horrific reality of the concentration camps is so central to our memory of the war that it seems obvious, right? But historically, it's not that simple. Saving the Jewish people was, tragically, not a central war aim for the Allied governments. The initial and overwhelming goal was military victory, defeat Germany, Japan, and Italy, and end their aggression. The full, systematic horror of the final solution was not widely understood by the public or even at the highest levels of government in the early years of the war. Reports of atrocities did trickle out. Jewish organizations and resistance groups tried desperately to get the word to the Allies, but their pleas were often met with disbelief or were downplayed. To many, the stories seemed too monstrous to be true. Allied leaders were also concerned that focusing on the plight of the Jewish people would be seen as propaganda. They worried it would reinforce the Nazi claim that the war was a Jewish war, potentially weakening public support for the massive sacrifices required. So the strategic focus remained on military targets. There were debates about whether to bomb the railway lines leading to camps like Auschwitz. The official stance was that the best and fastest way to save everyone under Nazi rule was to win the war as quickly as possible. Any diversion of resources from purely military objectives, they argued, would prolong the conflict and ultimately cost more lives. It wasn't until Allied troops began liberating the camps in 1944 and 1945 that the full, soul-crushing extent of the Holocaust was laid bare for the world to see. The images and survivor testimonies were undeniable and horrifying. While the ultimate Allied victory did end the genocide, and there were heroic individuals who risked everything to save people, the rescue of the Jews was a consequence of that victory, not its primary objective from the outset. It is a somber and uncomfortable truth that reminds us how complex and often grim the calculations of war can be. All right, let's journey much further back in time for our third and final myth, one literally set in stone. Close your eyes and picture the Great Pyramids of Giza. What do you see? Massive stone blocks, the hot Egyptian sun, and thousands upon thousands of slaves, whipped and driven by cruel overseers. This image, popularized by Hollywood movies and ancient accounts, is one of the most enduring in all of history. But what if I told you the pyramids were not built by slaves? Modern archaeology and the discovery of new evidence have completely overturned this old theory. The real builders of the pyramids were skilled, well-fed, and respected Egyptian laborers. How do we know this? One of the most significant breakthroughs was the discovery of a workers' village and cemetery right next to the pyramids. By excavating these tombs, archaeologists like the famed Zahi Hawass found something remarkable. The people buried there weren't just discarded, they were buried with honor near the pyramids they helped build, a privilege never afforded to slaves. Their skeletons tell a fascinating story. Analysis shows they ate a diet rich in protein, beef, bread, and beer. Beef, in particular, was a luxury in ancient Egypt, suggesting these workers were highly valued. Their bones also showed signs of hard labor, of course. Arthritis and strained backs were common. But they also showed evidence of expert medical care. We're talking set bones and even successful amputations. These were people who were cared for, who received treatment for their injuries so they could return to work. Slaves would have been worked to death and replaced. So, who were they? They were likely seasonal workers, farmers who came to work on the Pharaoh's grand project during the Nile's annual flood when their fields were underwater. It was a form of national service, a way to contribute to a project that was central to their culture and religion. They worked in rotating crews with team names like the Drunkards of Menkaura or the Friends of Khufu, which shows a sense of camaraderie, not subjugation. These workers weren't forced into labor under the threat of a whip. They were organized, compensated, and motivated by a deep sense of civic and religious duty. They were building an eternal home for their god king, a monument that would ensure the stability and prosperity of their entire world. The pyramid wasn't just a tomb, it was a national project that brought the country together. The idea of enslaved masses building the pyramids is a dramatic tale, but the reality of a dedicated, respected workforce is, in its own way, even more impressive. So there you have it. 3 facts turned on their heads. The U.S. was in the war long before Pearl Harbor. Saving the Jews was not the initial Allied goal, and the pyramids were built by paid Egyptian workers, not slaves. History is a living, breathing thing that changes as we uncover more of the story. It's so much more than just a dusty old textbook. What historical fact have you learned was actually a myth? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear about it. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, please give this video a thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you do not miss our next deep dive. Thanks for watching and see you next time.